Hey there, it's Simon here with another production lesson. So, last week in the production of Sprite Fright, I created the Hairspray Effect, and I thought those would be a nice effect to just break down and show the different steps that go into it. They're using geometry nodes from start to finish, and because those are still a relatively new feature in Blender, I thought it might be nice to use this opportunity and just showcase how they work in general and how we already use them in the production, because we're already using them quite a lot in different places. So yeah, let's just go right into it. All right, so the hairspray effect is featured in a couple of shots, but the most prominent one is this one, where Victoria is running around and fighting the sprites with the hairspray. So this is how we got the shot from the animators. I just played here, they just drew in some reference. But obviously for rendering, we want to turn it into something a little bit more fancy. And generally the idea for this was to have a kind of stylized effect where we would have, similar as in the drawings there, this kind of cone shape that would then end in these sort of bubbles here, and have these like streaks in here, but this general overall shape which is kind of cartoony, a little bit like a little bit stylized, but from rendering still on the more like realistic side in terms of like volumetric shading and that kind of stuff. And the question was, how do we want to pull that off? Immediately for something like this, it's the question of, okay, do we simulate this? Do we do a smoke simulation, some particle simulation or something? And then I just wanted to do some testing first with geometry nodes. And that's actually how we also then ended up doing it, because it worked quite well. So yeah, let me now show you how the result then was of that one shot. There you go. So that's the effect that you can see. Pretty stylized, pretty much what I just drew out here. So we have this cone shape here with a couple of streaks and then these bubbles in the end. And in terms of rendering, this is how it looks. Generally quite subtle, the stylized effect. And yeah, the idea was to have these streaks in here, like very slightly as well, and then fade it out towards the end to have more of a density towards the spray can itself. And yeah, let's actually take a look at how it's done. So this here is the actual final effects prop, the asset that I created to use in the shots. It's just using this geometry node tree and then a couple of other modifiers to just clean it up a little bit. The nice thing about creating an effects prop with geometry nodes like this is that you can just, in the beginning, go in and work very loosely with these with this node setup and just mock up something, and then later on go in and streamline everything, make sure that the right parameters are exposed in the modifier UI to be able to change the things that we need to change. But in the beginning, it's a very loose workflow, and that's very nice. Yeah, let me just quickly give you an overview of what this asset can actually do before we jump into how it's done. So I have one vector parameter that lets me just fade out the effect. So the cone only exists when the factor is 1. Otherwise, I can just scale down the points here. The angle, just to adjust how wide the effect is supposed to be. Density to affect how many of these blobs are created. It also just changes the effect overall. And then, very important, a viewport resolution slider to just make it more performant. This slider doesn't actually influence the rendered performance, but only for the viewport. So this is basically a slider of a percentage of full resolution, how it's going to be rendered, and then just a preview resolution to just have a very fast playback. And that's actually really nice about this asset. It's just playing back at real time, and it's very nice to work with this. And then a frame offset. So the reason for that is that the way this is created, it's not going to just run infinitely. As you can see, there's also a frame length. So after 100 frames, it's just going to stop. And the frame offset is just there to move the start of when this is actually happening. The reason for that is just how the particles that are used are generated. And yeah, it's not a simulation. It's similar to a simulation, but it's not actually a simulation. And because of that, the geometry needs to be known. Basically, it needs to be known how many particles go in and out. And then the frame steps is just a parameter that I added, and just if we wanted to stylize the animation itself. Generally, the animation style of Sprite Fright is using like a mixture of animation on twos and ones. It's generally on twos. So for the effects, it's just a question of how much do we follow that and how well does it fit together. So for a very fast effect like this, we do end up going with ones, but this is just there to enable having a more choppy playback. And then there's the speed parameter that just changes the overall playback speed of the animation. And then a seed value just to change the randomization, because this is fully procedurally generated and it's using random parameters to give some variation. You also want to be able to control the random variation to just select something else if the result that you get doesn't look quite right. Or especially if you have multiple of these assets in one scene, you don't want them all to look the exact same, so you can just change the seed around and then have some variations. And yeah, then additionally, there's a couple of more modifiers. So these two here are just there to clean up the model, because maybe you noticed already that there's some artifacts going on because of the meshing. And to get rid of those, I have a smooth and a decimate modifier. It takes a while to evaluate, to just clean this up a little bit. Yeah, but I have them off by default because they really take a long time to evaluate, the decimate modifier particularly. But yeah, those are not actually needed for the preview, so I just keep it at like 25% resolution and these off, and then it's all good. And there's also a simple deform modifier.